Right now, the Colorado River's two giant reservoirs are sinking inside the same system that supplies water, power, and food security to more than 40 million people across the American West. That is what makes this crisis different. Lake Mead and Lake Powell are not isolated bodies of water, losing a little volume in a dry year. They are the two largest emergency reserves on a river that runs through 7 states, crosses an international border, feeds major cities, irrigates farms, and supports hydropower. The Bureau of Reclamation says long-term drought has pushed Colorado River system storage to about 36% of capacity, while Lake Powell has been projected close to the minimum power pool of 3,490 feet. But that is not the scariest part. The real danger is not simply that the water line is lower, it is that the buffer is disappearing. These reservoirs do not only store water, they store time, political room, electrical stability, crop decisions, and the ability to survive one more bad winter without turning every shortage into an emergency. So the question is no longer whether the Colorado River is having another dry cycle. The question is what happens when a 20th century water machine is forced to operate inside a hotter, drier, less predictable climate. Like, subscribe, and comment where they are watching from, because this river crisis is not just a Western story. It is a warning about systems everywhere. The first place to look is not the middle of the river, it is the edge of the cities. In southern Nevada, Lake Mead is not a distant landmark, it is the intake behind the faucet. The Southern Nevada Water Authority says the region gets about 90% of its water from the Colorado River, most of it drawn from Lake Mead. That means the falling reservoir is not simply a view from a bridge near Hoover Dam. It is connected to kitchens in Las Vegas, hospital cooling systems in Henderson, hotel laundry rooms on the Strip, school drinking fountains, construction sites, golf courses, and the pipes buried beneath neighborhoods that were built on the assumption that the river would keep arriving. Las Vegas has done something many cities have not. It has cut per-person water use sharply, removed decorative grass, recycled indoor water. That matters. It proves adaptation is possible, but it also reveals the shape of the crisis. A city can become more efficient and still remain exposed when the reservoir beneath the whole regional system keeps dropping. Farther east, the same story turns into a canal. The Central Arizona Project moves Colorado River water from Lake Havasu across the desert toward Phoenix and Tucson. It is not a small ditch. It is one of the great pieces of modern desert engineering. A long artificial river pushed through pumps, aqueducts, tunnels, and control structures, so Central Arizona can function at the scale it does. The Bureau of Reclamation describes it as a project built to deliver Colorado River water into central and southern Arizona, including municipal supplies for the Phoenix and Tucson metropolitan areas. But the Central Arizona Project also shows how shortage moves through a system. It does not arrive as one dramatic shutoff, it arrives by priority. It arrives through contracts. It arrives through legal tiers. It arrives first to the users with weaker claims, then moves upward if the lake keeps falling. In Arizona, shortage reductions have already forced significant cuts to Colorado River supplies, with Central Arizona Project users carrying much of the burden. For some city residents, the water may still run when the tap turns. For some farmers, the cut can arrive as a field that is not planted, a loan that becomes harder to service, a groundwater well that has to run longer, or a crop plan that no longer makes sense. Then the river bends into California's food system. In the Imperial Valley, the Colorado River does not look like a crisis on the evening news. It looks like canals beside fields, workers in heat, packing sheds, irrigation gates, and rows of crops growing in a desert that receives very little rain. The Imperial Irrigation District says it delivers an annual entitlement of about 3.1 million acre-feet, and about 97% of its deliveries go to agriculture. That is the hidden scale of this river. It is not only drinking water, it is lettuce, hay, onions, carrots, dairy feed, wages, trucking routes, fertilizer bills, school district tax bases, and winter produce moving through the national food chain. This is why the reservoir story is not just a Western water story. When Lake Mead and Lake Powell fall, the pressure is transmitted into supermarkets. It moves from snowpack into runoff, from runoff into reservoirs, from reservoirs into canals, from canals into fields, from fields into prices, jobs, and meals. A shrinking reservoir can become a narrower planting window. A narrower planting window can become lower farm revenue. Lower farm revenue can become fewer shifts in a packing house. The crisis travels quietly before it becomes visible. Southern California is also tied into the same machine. The Colorado River Aqueduct, operated by the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, carries water across deserts and mountains toward coastal cities and suburbs. For many people near Los Angeles, Orange County, Riverside, San Bernardino, and San Diego, the Colorado River can feel abstract because the river itself is far away, but distance is misleading. The water has already crossed deserts before it reaches lawns, factories, apartment buildings, restaurants, ports, and emergency rooms. The crisis is not measured only by how close a community sits to the riverbank. It is measured by how deeply that community has been connected to a river it may never see. And then there are the communities that are too often pushed to the edge of the story. The Colorado River is a vital resource for 30 tribal nations, yet many native communities have lived for generations with a brutal contradiction. Recognized rights to water on paper, but inadequate infrastructure to deliver safe and reliable water to homes, farms, and businesses. In a falling reservoir system, that contradiction becomes sharper. A legal right is not the same as a pipe. A settlement is not the same as a treatment plant. A promise is not the same as pressure at the tap. When water becomes scarce, the people with the least infrastructure often have the least ability to turn a legal claim into daily security. Mexico is exposed too. The river does not stop being a system when it crosses a border. Under international agreements, water scarcity measures also affect deliveries to Mexico, including communities and agricultural regions in Baja California and Sonora. When Lake Mead stays in shortage, the cuts and conservation obligations ripple beyond the United States. The river becomes an international negotiation held inside a drying basin. The official warnings are not vague. The Bureau of Reclamation has said prolonged drought reduced Colorado River system storage to about 36% of capacity. It warned that poor snowpack and heat-intensified drought conditions across the basin, creating elevated risks to water and power infrastructure that supply more than 40 million people. It also projected that Lake Powell could fall below the minimum power pool at Glen Canyon Dam without major intervention, a level where normal hydropower generation becomes threatened and releases downstream become more operationally complicated. Lake Mead is also in shortage conditions. Federal operating determinations for the river have kept it in a Level 1 shortage condition, requiring reductions for Arizona, Nevada, and Mexico under existing agreements. That phrase can sound bureaucratic, almost dull. Level 1 shortage. But behind it is a simple fact. The system is already rationing risk. It is already deciding who absorbs pain first. It is already translating hydrology into law into cuts, and cuts into human consequences. That is why anyone watching should care, even far from the basin. The Colorado River is a preview of what happens when infrastructure built for one climate is forced to survive inside another. It shows how a reservoir decline becomes an electrical risk at Hoover Dam and Glen Canyon Dam. It shows how a dry winter in the mountains becomes a budget problem for a city, a planting decision for a farmer, a political fight between states, and a water security question for families who may never know which reservoir made their life possible. The scene, then, is larger than two blue shapes shrinking on a map. It is a whole regional machine, beginning to run with less margin. Cities are conserving, farmers are negotiating. Tribes are demanding a real place in decisions that affect their water. Mexico is tied into the shortage rules. Federal agencies are trying to protect dams, power plants, and deliveries at the same time. And beneath all of it, the lakes keep measuring the stress. The white bathtub rings on the canyon walls are not just stains. They are records of a system that once had room to absorb mistakes. Now that room is narrowing. The headline number is not the height of one lake on one morning. It is the amount of stored time left in the system. According to the Bureau of Reclamation, long-term drought has reduced Colorado River system storage to about 36% of capacity. That means the system is not approaching this crisis from a full tank. It is approaching it with roughly 2/3 of its storage space empty, while still being asked to serve cities, farms, power plants, ecosystems, tribes, industries, and international obligations. To understand the scale, the first unit has to be made visible. In the language of Western water, an acre-foot is the amount of water needed to cover 1 acre of land, 1 foot deep. That sounds technical until it is translated. The Bureau of Reclamation describes 1 acre-foot as approximately 326,000 gallons. It is not a glass of water. It is not a swimming pool. It is a volume large enough to become a household budget, a crop decision, a municipal planning document, or a legal fight. Lake Mead alone, at its high operating elevation near Hoover Dam, can hold about 28,945,000 acre-feet. Lake Powell, according to the United States Geological Survey, has a total storage capacity of about 25,160,000 acre-feet after updated measurements. Together, these two reservoirs represent more than 54 million acre-feet of designed storage. In gallons, that is not billions. It is more than 17 trillion gallons of potential storage. This is why the images of low water are so disturbing. They are not showing a small shortage. They are showing the partial emptying of one of the largest engineered water buffers on Earth. But the number gets stranger when it is compared to what the system was built to do. Lake Mead's own official fact sheet says that at high operating elevation, it could store the entire average flow of the Colorado River for about 2 years. That sentence is easy to pass over, but it is the heart of the system. The reservoir was not built merely to hold water behind a dam. It was built to smooth out time. Wet years could be saved. Dry years could be endured. Cities could grow because the river had been turned into a schedule. Now that schedule is thinning. If the system's storage is near 36% of capacity, the frightening part is not only the remaining volume. It is the lost cushion between a dry forecast and a forced decision. A full reservoir gives managers room to be wrong. A low reservoir punishes every wrong assumption. A weak snowpack stops being a statistic in the mountains and becomes a calculation about releases, shortages, power generation, pumping costs, crop acreage, and emergency planning. Then comes the second number, Lake Powell's minimum power pool. The Bureau of Reclamation has warned that Lake Powell may decline below 3,490 feet without major intervention. That elevation is not just another line on a chart. It is the minimum power pool for Glen Canyon Dam, the level below which normal hydropower generation becomes threatened. Above that line, water can move through turbines. Below that line, releases become more constrained, more complicated, and more risky for downstream users. This is where the headline changes shape. It is not simply that there may be less water. It is that less water can mean less electricity, less operational flexibility, and fewer safe choices. At Glen Canyon Dam, the water is not only stored, it is stacked. Its height creates pressure. That pressure drives turbines. The lake is a battery made of elevation. When the surface drops, the battery weakens. The official projections make this concrete. Reclamation's April assessment described Lake Powell's minimum probable inflow for the water year as just 2.78 million acre-feet, only 29% of the historical average. In ordinary language, that means the river may receive far less new water than the system was designed to expect. At the very moment, the reservoirs are already depleted. A person can imagine this as a household with a large savings account. For decades, the family believed the salary would always arrive within a familiar range. Sometimes higher, sometimes lower, but close enough. The savings account was there for bad months. Then the salary became smaller and more erratic. The bills stayed large, and the savings account had already been drawn down. The danger is not only the low balance, it is the fact that the next paycheck can no longer be trusted in the same way. That is the Colorado River's arithmetic. The third number is the number of people exposed. More than 40 million. This does not mean 40 million people wake up to dry taps at the same time. That would be a false image. The danger is more complex and more systemic. 40 million people are exposed because their lives are connected to the same river machine through different doors. Some enter through drinking water, some through hydropower, some through food grown in irrigated desert valleys, some through jobs, recreation, tribal water rights, municipal bonds, construction plans, or electricity contracts. Exposure is not the same as immediate collapse. It means dependence on a system with shrinking margin. That distinction matters because this crisis can be misunderstood in both directions. It can be exaggerated into apocalypse or softened into a local drought story. The numbers support neither mistake. The Colorado River system is still functioning. Water is still being delivered. Power is still being generated. Cities are still adapting. Farmers are still planting. But the numbers also show that the system is functioning with less reserve than it was designed to have. And the fourth number may be the most quietly unsettling of all. Lake Powell has already lost storage capacity to sediment. The United States Geological Survey found that Lake Powell's total storage capacity declined by about 1,833,000 acre-feet from the early reservoir calculations to the latest survey. Period. A loss of about 6.79%. Some of the space that once existed for water is no longer available because rivers carry sediment and reservoirs trap it. This does not mean sediment is the main cause of the current crisis. It is not. The main pressure is drought, heat, demand, and reduced runoff. But sediment adds a deeper lesson. Even the container changes. The reservoir is not a permanent vault. It is a working landscape, filling slowly with the ground the river carries. While climate reduces inflow and demand drains storage, time itself reduces the room available to store what remains. That is why the headline number cannot be treated as one isolated statistic. 36% storage is not just a percentage. 3,490 feet is not just an elevation. 2.78 million acre-feet of forecast inflow is not just a hydrology figure. More than 40 million people is not just a population count. Each number is a different view of the same machine under stress. The lake levels show the surface. The acre-feet show the volume. The power pool shows the mechanical threshold. The inflow forecast shows the weak refill. The population number shows the human exposure. Together, they say something blunt. The Colorado River is no longer being measured only by how much water remains. It is being measured by how close the system is getting to its operating edges. And that is why these numbers are abnormal. A reservoir can drop in a dry year and recover in a wet one. That has happened before. But a river system becomes more fragile when low storage, weak inflow, rising heat, legal overcommitment, and massive dependence overlap. The shock is not one number. The shock is the stack. One number can be managed. A stack of numbers becomes a warning. The part that is easiest to miss is also the part that makes the crisis more dangerous. It is not only the water, it is the time. A reservoir looks like a container, so the human eye is trained to judge it like a container. Full means safe, low means trouble, empty means disaster. That is the simple version, and it is not wrong, but it is incomplete. Lake Mead and Lake Powell were never just giant bowls of water behind concrete walls. They were built to turn a wild, seasonal, uneven river into something modern society could schedule. That was the promise. Snow would fall in the Rocky Mountains. Spring would send meltwater down through canyons. Dams would catch the rush. Cities would open taps in July from snow that fell months earlier. Farmers would plant in desert soil because the river had been stretched across the year. Power plants would generate electricity because water could be released through turbines when demand required it. The system was designed to borrow wetness from one season and spend it in another. In other words, the reservoirs stored time. They stored the time between a dry winter and a shortage declaration. They stored the time between a bad forecast and a political fight. They stored the time between a farmer's planting decision and the moment irrigation water reached the field. They stored the time between a city's growth plan and the day when the source behind that growth had to be questioned. When the reservoirs were high, the system could absorb error, a forecast could miss, a snowpack could disappoint, a summer could turn hotter than expected, a city could use more than planned, a farm district could negotiate slowly. The buffer was large enough to hide the delay, but when the reservoirs fall, delay itself becomes expensive. This is the hidden mechanism of the crisis. Low water does not simply reduce volume, it compresses decision time. It takes a problem that once unfolded over years and squeezes it into seasons. It takes a negotiation that once could wait for the next wet winter and drags it into the current operating plan. It takes a snowpack report in the mountains and turns it into an urgent question for power managers, irrigation districts, tribal leaders, city planners, and federal agencies. That is why the Colorado River crisis cannot be understood as a single drought year. A single dry year is painful. A long dry period is dangerous. But a depleted buffer changes the rules of every year that follows. Even a decent year may not be enough to restore confidence. Even a wet winter may become a pause, not a rescue, because the hole has become too deep and the demands have become too fixed. This is the line that matters. The system is losing the ability to wait. For decades, waiting was part of the management strategy. Wait for the next snowpack. Wait for conservation agreements. Wait for legal negotiations. Wait for voluntary reductions. Wait for a stronger monsoon. Wait for another federal operating guideline. Wait, because the reservoirs could carry the system while people argued. But a reservoir at low storage does not carry arguments the same way. It turns argument into exposure. Every month of delay becomes water that is not saved, powerhead that is not preserved, legal certainty that is not created, and risk that is pushed towards someone downstream. This is the difference between a shortage and a systemic shortage. A normal shortage asks, how much water is missing this year? A systemic shortage asks, how much time is left before the rules, the infrastructure, and the climate stop matching each other? That second question is the one hidden beneath the bathtub rings on the canyon walls. The white mineral lines at Lake Mead and Lake Powell are often shown as symbols of drought. They are dramatic because they make loss visible. They show where the water used to be, but their deeper meaning is temporal. Each line is not just a former elevation. It is a former margin. It is a year when managers had more room. It is a season when cities had more security. It is an operating range where hydropower had more pressure, canals had more certainty, and negotiations had more time. As the water drops, the past remains painted on the rock. The system can see what it used to have. The danger is not that every community will suddenly run out of water at once. That is not how this kind of crisis works. The danger is more subtle. The system begins to lose options before it loses all water. It loses cheap options first, then it loses comfortable options, then it loses voluntary options. Then it begins to choose between harms. Protect Lake Powell for hydropower, and the downstream math changes. Protect Lake Mead for lower basin deliveries, and upstream operations become more strained. Cut agricultural water, and fields, jobs, feed supplies, and rural economies absorb the shock. Spare cities, and someone else bears the reduction. Pump more groundwater, and the invisible reserve underground begins to pay the bill. Delay the cuts, and the reservoirs pay it instead. That is what lost time looks like in a water system. It does not look like one dramatic collapse. It looks like a narrowing hallway. At the beginning of the hallway, everyone is still moving. Water is still delivered. Electricity is still generated. Crops are still planted. Cities still issue permits. Suburbs still grow. Tourists still take photographs from the dam. The system still appears to function, but the walls are closer. A city that once planned water supplies over decades now has to watch seasonal runoff with a different kind of anxiety. A farmer who once decided between crops based on market prices now must consider whether water uncertainty makes the whole planting season too risky. A hydropower manager, who once relied on reservoir elevation as a stable asset, now watches the lake surface as a mechanical limit. A tribal community that has waited generations for water infrastructure now sees scarcity used as a reason to delay justice again. The crisis moves from hydrology into institutions. That is the part often left out. Water managers can measure acre-feet, engineers can measure elevation, meteorologists can measure snowpack. But lost time is harder to measure because it appears as pressure inside decisions. It appears when emergency measures become annual practice. It appears when temporary conservation agreements begin to look like the foundation of the system. It appears when every wet spell is treated like relief, but not like recovery. This is why one wet winter does not erase the problem. It can help. It can raise a reservoir. It can delay a threshold. It can reduce immediate danger. But it cannot by itself restore a lost operating philosophy. The Colorado River was divided, developed, and built around assumptions from a cooler past. The basin is now hotter. Heat makes the atmosphere thirstier. Dry soil takes more of the snowmelt before it becomes runoff. Earlier melt changes the timing. Demand remains immense. The law still carries the weight of promises made when the river was believed to be larger than it really is. So the hidden crisis is not simply that the lakes are low. The hidden crisis is that the clock is speeding up. A low reservoir makes the future arrive faster. A bad snow season arrives faster. A power risk arrives faster. A shortage tier arrives faster. A legal conflict arrives faster. A city's adaptation deadline arrives faster. The same event that once would have been absorbed by storage now travels through the system with less resistance. This is what the viewer is meant to see when looking at Lake Mead and Lake Powell, not just water below a shoreline, not just exposed rock, not just boats stranded far from old ramps. The real image is a clock with water for hands. Each foot of elevation is time. Each acre-foot is time. Each delayed agreement spends time. Each hotter summer burns time. Each season of reduced runoff removes time that cannot be replaced by optimism. And when a system loses enough time, it can still look alive while becoming more brittle. That is the turning point. The Colorado River crisis is not only about how much water remains in the reservoirs, it is about how little time remains for the people who depend on them to change the system before the system changes them. The mechanism has a name, and the name matters because it changes the story. It is called aridification. Not drought alone, not simply a dry spell, not just one bad snow season. Aridification is the long-term drying of a landscape as rising heat changes how water moves through air, snow, soil, plants, rivers, and reservoirs. Drought sounds temporary, like something that begins, hurts, and then ends. Aridification is different. It is not just the absence of water falling from the sky. It is the growing power of the atmosphere and the land to take water before the river can use it. That is the hidden engine behind the sinking reservoirs. The Colorado River begins high, far from the cities that depend on it. Its most important water does not start as rain on Phoenix, Las Vegas, Los Angeles, or the Imperial Valley. It starts as snow in the mountains of Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and New Mexico. Snow is the river's seasonal storage system before the dams ever touch it. The mountains hold winter in place. Then spring turns that stored winter into runoff. In a cooler climate, more snow stays snow for longer. It reflects sunlight. It melts later. It feeds streams at a pace the system has learned to expect. The soil may still be dry, and the year may still be difficult. But the mountain snowpack acts like a white savings account. It does not just contain water. It controls timing. But warming changes that account. Scientists at the United States Geological Survey and NOAA found that Colorado River flow has been shrinking, in part because warming reduces reflective snow cover and increases evaporation. When snow disappears earlier, darker ground is exposed sooner. Darker ground absorbs more solar energy. That added energy heats the surface, dries the soil, and helps move more water back into the atmosphere instead of down into streams. The process is not mysterious. It is physics passing through a watershed. This is why a snowpack number can mislead if it is read alone. A basin can receive snow and still produce less runoff than expected. The question is no longer only how much snow fell. The question is, how much of that snow survives long enough, melts at the right time, crosses dry soil, enters tributaries, and reaches the reservoirs. In a hotter basin, the path between snow and reservoir becomes more expensive. The river pays that cost before people even see it. First, warmer air demands more moisture. The atmosphere behaves like a larger sponge. When temperatures rise, the air can hold more water vapor, and the landscape is pushed to supply it. Water leaves soil, leaves plants, leaves open water surfaces, and returns to the sky. This is called evapotranspiration, a word that combines evaporation from surfaces and transpiration from plants. It sounds technical, but the image is simple. The air is drinking, then the soil begins to matter more. Dry soil is not a passive surface, it is a debt. When snow melts into soil that has been baked by heat and drought, part of the meltwater goes first into refilling that soil moisture deficit. Before the stream receives water, the ground takes its share. This is not theft. It is the land trying to rehydrate itself. But for a river system that depends on runoff, it means the first pulse of meltwater can vanish into the basin before it ever becomes flow. Then plants become part of the mechanism. Vegetation uses water to grow, cool itself, and survive. In hotter conditions, crops, forests, grasses, and shrubs can demand more water, especially when the growing season lengthens or heat stress intensifies. That water can still be useful inside an ecosystem or farm, but if it leaves through plant transpiration, it does not move downstream into Lake Powell or Lake Mead. Finally, the reservoirs themselves lose water to the sky. Large open reservoirs in hot, dry country are exposed surfaces. They are not sealed vaults. They are wide mirrors of water under desert air. Every day, some portion leaves as evaporation. When the system is full, those losses are part of the expected cost of storage. When the system is low, every loss feels sharper because the margin has already thinned. This is the chain. Heat touches snow. Snow exposes ground. Ground absorbs sunlight. Soil dries. Plants pull. Air drinks. Streams weaken. Reservoirs fall. And then the human system receives the bill. A rancher does not experience aridification as a climate term. He experiences it as less reliable irrigation water, higher feed costs, and a decision about whether keeping a herd through another dry year is financially possible. A farm worker does not experience it as an academic graph. She experiences it as fewer acres planted, fewer harvest days, more heat exposure, and a thinner paycheck. A city planner does not experience it as a line in a journal. He experiences it as a water demand forecast that no longer fits the past. A hydropower operator does not experience it as a debate about language. She experiences it as lower reservoir elevation and less pressure through the turbines. The mechanism begins in the atmosphere, but it ends in the budget, the field, the power grid, and the body. This is why the Colorado River crisis feels so difficult to solve. A normal drought response asks people to endure scarcity until the weather turns. Aridification asks something harder. It asks a society to change the assumptions built into cities, farms, laws, dams, and expectations, because the baseline itself has shifted. Research has put numbers on this shift. A major scientific study estimated that Colorado River annual mean discharge has been decreasing by about 9.3% per degree Celsius of warming, largely because warming-driven snow loss increases evaporation. Another study found that the Colorado Basin's runoff has declined by about 8.1% per degree Celsius of warming over the historical period, with a somewhat lower sensitivity when vegetation response to carbon dioxide is included. The exact number can vary by method, but the direction is consistent. Heat reduces the river's efficiency. That phrase is crucial. Heat reduces the river's efficiency. The same basin can receive water from the sky, but less of it becomes usable river flow. It is like a pipe that leaks more as the room gets hotter, or like a paycheck that shrinks through fees before it reaches the bank account. The gross income is snow and precipitation. The net income is runoff. The reservoirs do not live on the gross number. They live on what arrives. This is the hidden math behind the bathtub rings. People often imagine a river as a blue line on a map, steady and separate from the land around it. But a river is not separate. It is the final remainder of everything that happened across the basin. It is what is left after the atmosphere, the soil, the plants, the groundwater, the farms, the canals, and the reservoirs have all taken their share. The Colorado River at its dams is not the beginning of the story. It is the result. That result is becoming smaller and less predictable. There is another layer, and it is underground. Groundwater contributes baseflow to streams in many parts of the Colorado River basin. Baseflow is the portion of streamflow that comes from underground water, slowly feeding rivers and creeks. It is less visible than snowmelt, but it matters because it helps sustain flow when the surface is dry. The United States Geological Survey has warned that groundwater flow to the Colorado River could decline substantially under hotter, drier climate scenarios. That means the invisible backup system is also under stress. Again, the danger is not one broken piece. It is the alignment of many stressed pieces. Less snow efficiency, drier soil, more atmospheric thirst, higher evaporation, weaker base flow, more groundwater pumping when surface supplies shrink, greater crop water demand under heat, more energy demand for cooling in cities, lower hydropower potential when reservoirs drop. Each factor is understandable by itself. Together, they become a system that is harder to stabilize. This is where the metaphor of a sinking reservoir becomes too small. Lake Mead and Lake Powell are not only sinking because water is being used, they are sinking because the entire watershed feeding them is being pulled in two directions at once. Less dependable inflow from above, persistent demand from below. The reservoirs sit in the middle like lungs, asked to keep breathing while the air gets thinner and the body keeps running. That is the physical mechanism. But the practical consequence is even more direct. The river no longer gives the same return on the same winter. A mountain storm can still be powerful. A wet year can still raise lake levels. Snow can still pile up across the Rockies and bring relief. Nothing about aridification means every year becomes dry or every storm becomes useless. That would be false. The Colorado River still has wet years, and those wet years matter enormously. But the recovery is less secure when the basin is hotter. A wet year may refill part of the account, but heat keeps charging interest. Dry soil keeps demanding repayment. Reservoir evaporation continues. Cities and farms still withdraw water. The next winter may not cooperate. The next summer may erase more than expected. So, aridification is not a single disaster. It is a pressure that changes the meaning of every year. That is why the two giant reservoirs are such powerful evidence. They translate a complex climate mechanism into a visible line on rock. The atmosphere cannot be seen drinking. Soil moisture deficits are not visible from a highway overlook. Evapotranspiration does not look dramatic on camera. Baseflow decline happens underground. But Lake Mead and Lake Powell show the accumulation. They show the final balance after the hidden withdrawals have already occurred. And that balance is the warning. The Colorado River is not just losing water in the reservoirs. It is losing the old conversion machine that turned mountain snow into dependable civilization-scale supply. The snow still falls. The river still runs. The dams still stand. The canals still deliver. But the mechanism underneath has changed. Heat has entered the system like an unseen pump, pulling water upward before gravity can carry it down. The Colorado River has warned before. The difference is that the warnings used to look temporary. A low reservoir could be explained as a bad year. A dry winter could be explained as bad luck. A harsh summer could be explained as weather. A shortage negotiation could be treated as a political problem, separate from the river itself. Each crisis could be placed in its own box, given its own label, and pushed forward with the hope that the next wet season would make the whole system easier to manage. But history is beginning to show a pattern. The first warning was hidden inside the river's paperwork. In the early 20th century, the Colorado River was divided through legal agreements that assumed more water than the river would reliably provide over the long term. The famous Compact Era built a river of promises. Cities, farms, canals, dams, power plants, and state economies grew around those promises. The river on paper became larger than the river in stone, snow, soil, and heat. That overconfidence mattered because it shaped the century that followed. Hoover Dam rose. Lake Mead filled. Glen Canyon Dam followed. Lake Powell spread backward through canyons. The river was converted into a managed machine, and for a long time, the machine seemed strong enough to silence doubt. It delivered water to desert farms. It powered cities. It allowed metropolitan growth on a scale that would have been almost impossible without imported river water. Then the 21st century began, and the river entered a different kind of test. Scientists now describe the period beginning around the year 2000 as part of an exceptional southwestern North American megadrought. A major study published in Nature Climate Change found that the period from 2000 through 2021 was the driest 22-year span in the region since at least the year 800. That does not mean there were no wet months, no strong storms, or no years of relief. It means the background condition became persistently dry enough to stand out across more than 12 centuries of reconstructed climate history. That is the historical scale that changes the mood of the present. The current reservoir decline is not happening in an empty timeline. It is happening after more than 2 decades, in which the basin has been repeatedly reminded that the old range of expectation may no longer be safe. Lake Mead and Lake Powell did not wake up low overnight. They were drawn down through years of weak inflow, high demand, evaporation, heat, and emergency management. The present crisis is the visible end of a long accumulation. The year 2021 became one of the clearest breaks in public consciousness. The Bureau of Reclamation declared the first ever Level 1 shortage condition for Lake Mead, triggered by projected reservoir elevation below the formal shortage threshold. That phrase, first ever, carried weight. It meant the shortage rules were no longer theoretical. The legal machinery built for scarcity had moved from planning documents into actual reductions. The cuts did not fall evenly. Arizona took the largest reduction under that shortage tier. Nevada and Mexico also faced reductions. California, because of its senior water rights in the lower basin, did not take the same immediate cut under that tier. That detail matters because it shows that drought does not travel through society like rainfall. Rain falls across landscapes. Shortage moves through priority systems. It follows law, contracts, history, infrastructure, and power. A person looking only at the lake might ask, how low is the water? But a person looking at the system has to ask another question. Who is first in line when the river shrinks? And who is last? Then came the emergency measures around Lake Powell. The Bureau of Reclamation's drought response operations were designed to reduce the risk of Lake Powell falling below critical elevations. In practice, that meant managers had to do something that reveals the fragility of the whole basin, move risk from one reservoir to another, and from one part of the system to another. Water could be released from upstream reservoirs such as Flaming Gorge to support Lake Powell. Releases from Lake Powell could be adjusted to protect the elevation needed for Glen Canyon Dam. But none of these moves created new water. They only changed where the danger sat. That is what makes a precedent so important. A true emergency action is supposed to be rare. It is supposed to buy time during an unusual moment. But when the climate pressure continues, emergency tools begin to look less like exceptions and more like the operating manual. This is not imagination. It has already happened. The Drought Response Operations Agreement, part of the Upper Basin Drought Contingency Framework, was implemented in earlier years to protect Lake Powell from falling below critical elevations, and federal officials have continued planning additional actions as reservoir risk returned. The language is careful, the mechanism is technical, but the meaning is stark. The system has reached the point where managers must actively defend the ability of a major dam to keep functioning in its normal operating range. That should not be treated as a small footnote. Glen Canyon Dam was built as a centerpiece of 20th century water control. It was not supposed to become a structure whose power generation margin required recurring emergency defense. Yet the basin has already seen what happens when the lake nears its mechanical limits. Hydropower becomes less certain. Downstream release planning becomes more tense. Upstream reservoirs become potential sources of rescue water. The system starts borrowing from one pocket to protect another. This is how the past speaks to the present, not through one disaster, but through the repetition of near misses. A near miss is dangerous because it can be misread. If the system avoids collapse, people may conclude that the system was safe. If a wet winter raises the reservoir, people may conclude the crisis is over. If emergency releases protect a power pool, people may conclude the managers solved the problem. But a near miss should be read differently. It proves the threshold was close enough to require intervention. The Colorado River has had relief years. Snow has returned. Lake levels have risen after deep lows. Conservation deals have reduced some demand. Cities have improved efficiency. These successes are real and should not be dismissed. They show that human decisions matter. They show that policy, technology, and behavior can bend the curve. But relief is not the same as recovery. A wet year can lift a reservoir, but it does not erase the structural mismatch between supply and demand. A conservation agreement can save water, but it does not automatically rewrite a century of legal expectation. An emergency release can protect hydropower for a season, but it does not make the upstream reservoir whole. A shortage declaration can force reductions, but it does not answer the deeper question of how much river the future can support. This is why the historical comparison is so unsettling. The Colorado River system was built to tame variability, yet the basin is now facing variability on top of long-term drying. In the past, the reservoir system could treat drought as an interruption. Now drought, heat, and aridification are becoming part of the operating environment. The interruption is becoming the background. The comparison with the late 1500s megadrought is useful, but only if it is handled carefully. It does not mean the current drought is identical to that ancient event. The modern Southwest has huge cities, intensive irrigated agriculture, hydropower networks, legal water rights, highways, hospitals, data centers, and international agreements. The old drought stressed ecosystems and indigenous societies in ways recorded through tree rings and archaeology. The modern drought stresses a machine civilization built on fixed infrastructure and rising demand. That makes the present more exposed, not because nature has never been dry before, but because the amount of human dependency has become enormous. The river has always varied. The West has always known dry years. But the modern system added millions of people, huge farms, and permanent expectations to a river that was already variable. Then, warming changed the efficiency of the watershed. The result is not simply the return of an old drought cycle. It is old variability colliding with modern dependence and a hotter atmosphere. That is the lesson of the precedent. The first shortage declaration was a signal. The emergency actions to protect Lake Powell were a signal. The megadrought research was a signal. The recurring negotiations over cuts were a signal. Each one said the same thing in a different language. The Colorado River system is being pushed from managed scarcity towards structural adaptation. There is still time to adapt. That must be said clearly. The system has not failed. Cities have not gone dark because of Glen Canyon Dam. The great canals have not gone silent. The river still supplies homes, farms, and power. But the history of the last 2 decades shows that the basin is no longer moving from crisis to normal. It is moving from crisis to partial relief to crisis again. That rhythm is the warning. A true precedent is not a prophecy. It is a pattern that makes denial harder. The past does not say exactly what will happen next. It says what has already become possible. It says a first-ever shortage can happen. It says emergency reservoir operations can become necessary. It says A 22-year drought can become the driest in at least 1,200 years. It says a wet year can help without solving the deeper mismatch. And once those things have happened, the future cannot be imagined from the old baseline anymore. The vulnerability of the Colorado River system is not hidden in one dramatic place. It is hidden in small thresholds. A reservoir can look vast from above and still be fragile at a single opening in concrete. A canal can run for hundreds of miles and still depend on one pumping chain. A city can have conservation programs, emergency plans, and legal contracts, but still need water to reach an intake at the right elevation. A power plant can look permanent from the outside, but inside it depends on the height of water pressing through turbines. A farm valley can appear green from the highway, but its season may depend on whether one delivery category gets cut before another. This is the layer beneath the headline. 40 million people are not exposed in the same way. Some are exposed through taps, some through electricity, some through food, some through jobs, some through groundwater debt, some through rights that exist on paper but still do not arrive through pipes. The danger is unequal, and that inequality is part of the system's design. Start at Lake Powell. At Glen Canyon Dam, the critical number is not just the lake's surface elevation. It is the relationship between that elevation and the dam's machinery. The Bureau of Reclamation has identified 3,490 feet as the minimum power pool. Below that level, normal hydropower generation is no longer protected in the same way, and releases would depend more heavily on river outlet works rather than the usual turbine system. Reclamation has also described 3,525 feet as a target elevation that gives a 35-foot buffer above that minimum power pool. That buffer sounds technical. It is not. It is the thin cushion between a functioning hydropower asset and a much more uncertain operating world. Glen Canyon Dam does not only make electricity for a map of wires, it helps support regional power supplies. When water is high enough, gravity becomes energy. The lake surface pushes water downward through penstocks. The force turns turbines, and the river becomes power. But when the lake falls, the height difference shrinks. The pressure weakens. The dam can generate less efficiently, and if the lake falls too far, generation is threatened altogether. The small part that matters here is not the dam wall. It is the elevation of the water above the intakes that feed the power system. A falling lake turns height into risk. That risk then moves outward. Less hydropower can mean more reliance on other electricity sources. In a hot region, that matters because summer water stress and summer electricity demand can arrive together. Air conditioners run harder, just as reservoirs are under pressure. Hospitals need cooling. Older people need cooling. Data centers need cooling. Water treatment plants need electricity. Pumping stations need electricity. A reservoir problem can become a grid problem, and a grid problem can become a public health problem during extreme heat. The chain is not dramatic at first. It begins with elevation, then pressure, then turbines, then power supply, then cooling, then bodies. That is how infrastructure makes climate personal. Now move downstream to Lake Mead. Southern Nevada has prepared more aggressively than many places. The Southern Nevada Water Authority built Intake 3 and a low lake-level pumping station so the region could continue accessing its primary water supply, even as Lake Mead declined. This is often described as resilience, and it is. Las Vegas did not simply wait for the lake to fall. It invested in deeper access, removed large amounts of decorative grass, and reduced per-person water use. But this is also a warning. The fact that such infrastructure was needed shows how close the old system came to its operating edge. A deeper intake does not create new river water. It changes the point at which the city can still reach what remains. It protects the tap from one kind of failure, but it does not refill the reservoir behind the tap. The small part that matters here is a pipe mouth under a lake. If the pipe can reach water, the city can keep functioning. If water quality declines, treatment becomes harder. If pumping must lift water from lower elevations, energy use can rise. If the reservoir keeps falling, the engineering problem does not disappear. It moves deeper. That is the paradox of adaptation. Good adaptation saves lives and buys time, but it can also hide the severity of the crisis from people who only judge danger by whether water still comes out of the faucet. A person in Las Vegas may never see the lake. A visitor may walk through a casino, hear fountains, shower in a hotel, and assume the crisis is exaggerated. But the regional system knows better. It has already had to chase the lake downward. Now follow the water into Arizona. The Central Arizona Project is one of the clearest examples of a small legal detail becoming a major vulnerability. It moves Colorado River water across the desert to central and southern Arizona, serving cities, tribes, industries, and agricultural users. But in shortage, not all water has the same strength. Water is organized by priority. The official Central Arizona Shortage Framework describes Colorado River supplies in priority levels, with the highest priority being the last to be cut. That means shortage is not simply physical, it is hierarchical. The canal may still exist, the pumps may still run, the concrete may still be intact, but the right to receive water through that system can shrink before the machinery breaks. For some agricultural users in central Arizona, this has already meant deep exposure. If a lower priority supply is reduced, the field is the place where the legal system becomes visible. A farmer may turn to groundwater, fallow land, change crops, sell land, or leave a field dry. Each decision then moves through equipment loans, labor schedules, feed markets, and rural economies. The weak point is not only the canal, it is the priority table. That is one of the most important ideas in the basin. Infrastructure does not fail only when concrete cracks. It can fail socially when the rules built into it distribute pain faster than communities can absorb it. In California's Imperial Valley, the vulnerability looks different. The valley has senior rights and a large agricultural entitlement. That makes it powerful in the legal structure, but not invincible in the physical one. The Imperial Valley depends on canals, drains, farm labor, heat safety, crop economics, and the continued ability to move water through a desert food system. If conservation pressure grows, the question becomes not only how many acre-feet can be saved, but what happens to the people and places built around using them. A field is not just a water demand. It is a workplace. It is a loan. It is a packing schedule. It is a truck route. It is animal feed somewhere else. It is income moving through a town. When water cuts reach agriculture, the effect does not stop at the irrigation gate. The small part that matters here is the planting window. If water uncertainty arrives too late, a farmer may already have invested in seed, labor, fertilizer, equipment, and contracts. If it arrives early enough, land may be fallowed before those costs are taken. If it lasts for years, the local economy changes shape. A reservoir decline hundreds of miles away can become a missing paycheck in a desert community. Then there are tribal communities, where the weakness is often not the legal right itself, but the infrastructure needed to use it. 30 federally recognized tribes have lands in the Colorado River Basin, and tribal nations hold or claim substantial rights to Colorado River water. Many of those rights are senior, meaning they can be older and legally stronger than later non-tribal uses. But strength on paper does not automatically produce water at a home, a farm, or a business. Pipes have to be built. Treatment systems have to be funded. Settlements have to be approved. Governance has to include tribal nations as actual decision makers, not afterthoughts. The weak point here is the gap between entitlement and delivery. A community can be legally entitled to water and still haul water. A nation can have a recognized claim and still lack the infrastructure to develop it. A family can live inside a basin that exports water to distant cities, while their own local system remains fragile. In a shortage era, this becomes more than an injustice from the past. It becomes a design failure in the present, because when scarcity intensifies, systems tend to protect what is already connected. Connected users can conserve, trade, bank, pump, treat, litigate, and negotiate from inside the machinery. Disconnected users are asked to wait. That waiting has a history. It also has a cost. In the Colorado River Basin, Any future plan that treats tribal water rights as secondary to state bargaining is not only politically incomplete, it is hydrologically dishonest, because the river's real demand cannot be understood while major rights remain unresolved or underdeveloped. Mexico adds another layer of exposure. Under international agreements, shortage and conservation obligations cross the border. Communities and farms in Mexico are part of the same river reality, even when the political debate is framed as a fight among American states. The river is international, but the reservoir decline is shared. A low Lake Mead can become a negotiation in 2 languages. This is why the headline number understates the danger. 40 million people exposed sounds large, but the more serious truth is that exposure is concentrated at specific weak points: a hydropower threshold, a municipal intake, a canal priority, a groundwater backup, a farm planting window, a tribal infrastructure gap, an international delivery agreement. These are the joints of the system. They are smaller than the river, but they decide how pain travels. And the pain does not travel evenly. Wealthier cities can finance new infrastructure. Some districts have stronger legal rights. Some farmers can switch crops or fallow land for compensation. Some households can pay higher bills. Some communities have lawyers, engineers, and access to negotiations. Others have a dry well, an old pipe, a hotter house, or a job that disappears when land is not planted. That is why this crisis is more dangerous than the water level alone. The lake elevation tells how much physical storage remains. It does not tell who can adapt, who can pay, who gets cut first, who is represented, who is asked to sacrifice, and who is invisible until the system breaks around them. Lake Mead and Lake Powell are sinking in public, but the most fragile parts of the Colorado River system are often quiet, buried, legal, mechanical, or human. A pipe mouth under a falling lake, a turbine waiting for enough pressure, a canal governed by priority, a field waiting for a delivery order, a tribal home waiting for infrastructure, a hospital waiting for power through a heat wave. This is where the crisis becomes real, not at the size of the reservoir, but at the exact point where the reservoir touches a life. At this point, the Colorado River story is no longer only about drought. It is about what happens when an entire regional system is forced to admit that its baseline has moved. For most of the 20th century, the river was treated as something that could be engineered into reliability. Dams would hold the flood. Reservoirs would smooth out dry years. Canals would carry water into deserts. Legal agreements would divide the supply. Cities would grow. Farms would plant. Power would be generated. And if the river had a bad year, the system would wait for the next good one. That was the old operating belief. The new reality is harsher. The system still works, but it works with less forgiveness. The river still flows, but not with the same reliability the 20th century assumed. The reservoirs still store water, but they are no longer full enough to hide every mistake. The law still assigns rights, but hydrology is pressing against those rights with a force no courtroom can negotiate away. This is how a reservoir crisis becomes a system crisis. Climate is the first layer. The Colorado River basin is hotter than it used to be, and heat does not merely make drought more uncomfortable. Heat changes the water budget. It dries soil, pulls water from vegetation, raises evaporation, lowers snowpack efficiency, and makes runoff less dependable. A dry year in a hotter basin is not the same as a dry year in a cooler basin. The same missing storm now lands on a landscape already thirstier than before. That means the old idea of normal is dangerous. Normal was built from the past. But the past included cooler temperatures, different snow behavior, and a smaller human footprint. If managers keep using the old river as the invisible reference point, every plan begins with a ghost. The second layer is infrastructure. The dams, canals, tunnels, pumping stations, hydropower plants, and aqueducts were built for a range of conditions. They were not designed for infinite flexibility. Every piece has thresholds. A reservoir must be high enough to push water through turbines. A canal must receive enough supply to justify its deliveries. A pumping station must lift water with electricity that remains affordable. A city intake must stay below the water surface. A treatment plant must handle changing water quality. A farm district must know whether water will arrive before the planting window closes. This is the real meaning of low storage. It brings infrastructure closer to its edges. When Lake Powell falls, the concern is not only the view from the canyon rim, it is whether Glen Canyon Dam can continue producing hydropower in the normal way. When Lake Mead falls, the concern is not only the bathtub ring on the rocks, it is how the lower basin manages deliveries, shortage tiers, Hoover Dam power, municipal intakes, and the politics of who cuts first. When both reservoirs are low at the same time, the system loses the ability to move stress around without creating another stress somewhere else. Protect Powell, and Mead may take the hit. Protect Mead, and Powell may approach its own limits. Preserve hydropower, and release decisions become more constrained. Preserve deliveries, and reservoir elevations may suffer. Preserve agriculture, and cities must do more. Preserve cities, and rural economies feel the blade. Preserve the legal order exactly as it stands, and the physical river may refuse to cooperate. That is why the Colorado River is now a test of governance. The Bureau of Reclamation's post-2026 process is not a routine paperwork exercise. It is the attempt to write operating rules for Lake Mead and Lake Powell for a future in which the old temporary guidelines are no longer enough. The current framework is approaching its expiration, and the basin states have struggled to agree on how deep the cuts should be, where they should fall, and how much of the burden should be carried by the lower basin, the upper basin, tribes, agriculture, cities, and federal operations. The fact that this negotiation is difficult should not surprise anyone. The river is overcommitted, the stakes are enormous, and every acre-foot has a constituency. Water is not just water in this basin. It is property value, crop revenue, tribal sovereignty, municipal growth, hydropower, recreation, ecological survival, and political power. So, when a state argues over cuts, it is not merely arguing over a number, it is arguing over which version of the future gets protected. The lower basin states have proposed large short-term conservation measures to save millions of acre-feet and buy time. Federal officials have considered deeper reductions tied to reservoir conditions. Upper basin states have pushed back against plans they believe place too much responsibility on them, or use upstream reservoirs in ways that threaten their own security. Tribal nations continue to insist that any future river plan must include their rights and their infrastructure needs, not treat them as footnotes after states finish bargaining. This is not just a water negotiation. It is a stress test of the entire political architecture of the river. And the test is happening while demand is changing. Cities in the Southwest are not frozen in place. Phoenix, Las Vegas, parts of Southern California, and other urban regions continue to face growth, pressure, housing demand, heat risk, and economic development debates. Some cities have made major progress in conservation. Las Vegas is the clearest example of a place that has reduced per-person water use and invested in infrastructure while continuing to function. That matters. It proves cities are not helpless, but conservation does not erase exposure. A city can become more efficient and still depend on a shrinking system. A new subdivision may use less water per household than an older one, but it still adds demand unless offset elsewhere. A data center, a factory, a warehouse district, a golf course, a hotel, or a cooling system all become part of the same question. What kind of economy is being built on a river that no longer behaves like the river that built the economy? Agriculture is the largest part of that question. Most Colorado River water use goes to agriculture. That does not make farmers villains. It makes them central. The modern West's food system was built with irrigation, and irrigation turned dry valleys into productive landscapes. Those fields produce income, feed, vegetables, winter crops, and rural jobs. But, in a shrinking river system, agriculture is also where large volumes of water can be conserved, transferred, fallowed, or fought over. This creates an uncomfortable truth. Any serious system solution must involve agriculture, but any careless agricultural cut can damage communities that are already exposed to heat, low wages, market pressure, and political neglect. The river crisis therefore cannot be solved by pointing at one user and saying, "Take less." The basin has to decide how to reduce use without destroying the people who have the least room to absorb the reduction. That means compensation, crop choices, soil health, labor protections, rural planning, tribal inclusion, groundwater limits, and honest accounting. Otherwise, water conservation becomes another word for shifting pain downward. Groundwater is the hidden third reservoir in this story, and it is not infinite. When surface water is cut, users often turn to groundwater. That can keep farms alive or cities supplied for a while. But groundwater pumping can lower aquifers, dry wells, cause land subsidence, and reduce the underground contribution that helps sustain streams. In some places, groundwater is treated like an emergency reserve. But if the emergency becomes permanent, the reserve becomes another system under stress. This is the pattern across the basin. Every backup has a limit. Reservoirs back up snowpack. Groundwater backs up surface water. Hydropower backs up the grid. Conservation backs up supply. Legal agreements back up operations. Emergency releases back up reservoir levels. But when every backup is used at once, the system is no longer resilient in the old sense. It is spending resilience. That is the new baseline. The new baseline does not mean every year is a disaster. It does not mean the Colorado River is gone. It does not mean cities must be abandoned or farms must disappear. The new baseline means the river system must now be managed as if low storage, hotter conditions, and faster-moving crises are not rare exceptions, but recurring features of the environment. This is a hard mental shift. Under the old baseline, a wet year felt like a return to normal. Under the new baseline, a wet year is a deposit into an account that remains structurally under pressure. Under the old baseline, drought plans were emergency documents. Under the new baseline, shortage planning becomes permanent governance. Under the old baseline, growth could assume that engineering would find more supply. Under the new baseline, growth has to prove it can exist within a smaller, more variable river. The system response is already overloaded because it has to solve multiple problems at the same time. It has to keep water in reservoirs high enough to protect infrastructure. It has to deliver enough water to cities to maintain public health. It has to reduce agricultural demand without collapsing rural economies. It has to respect tribal rights that have been delayed for too long. It has to preserve ecosystems that were already stressed before the latest shortage. It has to manage hydropower at a time when heat drives electricity demand higher. It has to negotiate across 7 states and 2 countries. And it has to do all of this while the climate signal keeps moving. That is why the sinking reservoirs matter beyond the Colorado River basin. They reveal a problem many systems are beginning to face. Infrastructure was built from historical averages. Climate change is attacking the averages. Legal systems were written around expected supply. Heat is changing supply. Cities were planned around distant sources. Those sources are becoming less dependable. Food systems were built around stable irrigation. Irrigation is now part of a basin-wide negotiation. The Colorado River is not unique because it is the only river in trouble. It is unique because the trouble is so visible, so measured, so engineered, and so tied to modern life. 2 giant reservoirs are acting like gauges on a civilization. They show how much margin remains between expectation and reality. When the gauges fall, the response cannot be only technical. It has to be cultural, legal, economic, and political. The old question was how to divide the river. The new question is how to live within the river that is actually arriving. There is one more layer before the conclusion, and it may be the layer that decides whether the story remains science or becomes fear. The Colorado River crisis has to be separated from the stories people want to attach to it. Some stories are true, some are partly true, some are convenient, some are dramatic but unsupported. And in a crisis this large, the difference matters. A river that supplies more than 40 million people does not need exaggeration to be frightening. The facts are already heavy enough. The first true thing is that climate change is connected to the shrinking reliability of the river. That does not mean every low water month, every dry hillside, or every difficult negotiation can be blamed on climate change alone. It means warming has changed the water budget of the basin. Scientific studies have found that higher temperatures reduce runoff efficiency in the Colorado River basin. Snow can still fall, but more water is lost to evaporation, dry soil, plant demand, and atmospheric thirst before it becomes usable stream flow. So the correct sentence is not that climate change created the Colorado River problem by itself. The correct sentence is that climate change is making an already overcommitted river harder to manage. That distinction is crucial. The second true thing is that human demand matters. The river has been promised, diverted, stored, pumped, irrigated, litigated, and engineered for more than a century. Cities grew because the river could be moved. Farms expanded because canals and rights turned desert land into productive land. Hydropower became part of the regional energy mix because reservoirs created height and pressure. None of that was accidental. The modern Southwest was built around the idea that the Colorado River could be made dependable, so it would be false to say the crisis is only natural. It would also be false to say it is only human. It is the collision that matters. A legally and physically overbuilt water system meeting a hotter and less forgiving basin. The third true thing is that low reservoirs are not the same as immediate dead pool. This is where fear often outruns evidence. Lake Mead and Lake Powell being low does not mean every city loses water at once. It does not mean taps in Phoenix, Las Vegas, Tucson, or Southern California suddenly go dry tomorrow. It does not mean Hoover Dam or Glen Canyon Dam instantly stop functioning the moment a headline says the lakes are sinking. Reservoirs have operating tiers, intake elevations, power pools, emergency rules, conservation agreements, and physical structures that matter. Danger rises by thresholds, not by one symbolic image. A lake can be low and still deliver water. A dam can face hydropower risk before it faces total release failure. A city can be exposed and still have backup plans. The truth is not instant collapse. The truth is shrinking margin. That is a more accurate warning, and in some ways a more disturbing one. Collapse is simple to imagine and easy to dismiss when it does not happen. Shrinking margin is harder to see, but it changes every decision. It changes how much water can be released, how much power can be generated, how much farmland can be planted, how much conservation must be negotiated, and how fast agencies must act. The fourth true thing is that agriculture is central, but blaming farmers alone is misleading. Agriculture uses the largest share of Colorado River water, especially in major irrigation districts. Any serious reduction plan has to involve farm water. That is basic arithmetic. But farming in the basin is not a cartoon of waste. It is food production, feed production, labor, rural economies, senior water rights, and communities that were encouraged for decades to build around river deliveries. The honest question is not whether agriculture must change. It must. The honest question is how change happens without making the least powerful workers and communities pay the highest price. A fallowed field can save water. It can also remove wages. A crop change can reduce demand. It can also require new markets, new equipment, new risk, and time. A water transfer can help a city. It can also drain the economic base of a rural valley if handled carelessly. So the river crisis is not solved by finding one villain. It is solved, if it is solved, by accounting for water, money, labor, law, and power in the same frame. Now come the things that are often said but not proven. It is not proven that one storm, one hot week, one dry month, or one bad snowpack report explains the sinking of the reservoirs. Those events can matter, but the reservoir crisis is cumulative. It comes from years of inflow, withdrawals, heat, evaporation, operations, and legal choices. A dramatic weather event can be part of the story without being the whole story. It is also not proven that every local water restriction means a city is about to fail. Some restrictions are signs of planned adaptation. Turf removal, conservation pricing, leak reduction, recycling, and drought rules can be evidence of stress, but they can also be evidence that a city is responding before the worst outcome. Adaptation should not be mocked as panic. It should not be mistaken for safety either. It is not proven that one wet winter ends the crisis. A strong snow year can raise reservoirs, delay dangerous thresholds, and reduce short-term pressure. That is real relief. But relief is not the same as structural recovery. A basin that has lost storage, faces high demand, and warms over time can receive a wet year and still remain exposed. Calling every wet year a rescue is as misleading as calling every dry year the end. It is not proven that technology alone will save the river. Desalination, wastewater recycling, cloud seeding, canal lining, precision irrigation, groundwater banking, and new storage all appear in public debate. Some tools can help. Some are already useful. But none cancels the basic arithmetic of a river with limited inflow and many claims. Technology can reduce waste. It can stretch supply. It can protect certain users. It cannot repeal heat, overcommitment, or gravity. There are also coincidences that should not be forced into a false pattern. A political fight between states may happen during a dry period, but the existence of that fight does not prove one state caused the hydrologic crisis. A low reservoir may coincide with urban growth, but not all growth has the same water footprint. A wildfire, heat wave, or dust storm may occur in the same broad region, but each event has its own mechanisms. Some are connected through heat and drought. Some are only overlapping symptoms of a stressed West. Evidence has to do the linking, not mood. This restraint is not weakness. It is what makes the warning stronger, because once the false claims are removed, the real danger remains. The real danger is that the Colorado River system has less storage than it needs, less reliable runoff than it once assumed, more legal demand than the river can comfortably satisfy, and more people and economies tied to its operation than any previous dry period in the basin's history. The real danger is that emergency measures become routine. The real danger is that every delay spends reservoir elevation. The real danger is that communities with weaker infrastructure absorb the first pain, while the larger system pretends it is still stable because the biggest cities still have water. The real danger is not a movie scene where the river disappears overnight. The real danger is a managed decline that feels normal until the choices have become smaller, harsher, and more expensive. That is the boundary between fact and fear. Fear says the West is doomed. Fact says the West is being forced to renegotiate its relationship with a river under hotter conditions. Fear says nothing can be done. Fact says choices still matter, but late choices cost more than early ones. Fear says the reservoirs are empty. Fact says they are low enough to expose the design assumptions behind the entire system, and that is enough. The story does not need a false apocalypse. It only needs the image already there. Two giant reservoirs sinking, not into myth, but into measurement. The image at the beginning returns now, but it looks different. Two giant reservoirs sit inside the canyons of the American West, and the pale rings on the rock show where the water used to be. At first, those rings looked like evidence of a lake falling. Then, they became something larger. They became the marks of a system losing height, losing storage, losing easy choices, and losing the old belief that tomorrow's river would behave like yesterday's river. Lake Mead and Lake Powell will rise and fall again. That must be said clearly. A wet winter can send snowpack into the mountains. A strong runoff season can lift the reservoirs. Conservation can save water. Cities can become more efficient. Farmers can change practices. Tribes can gain a stronger role in decisions that should have included them from the beginning. Governments can write better rules. This story is not over, but the old story is over. The old story said the Colorado River could be divided by law, captured by dams, moved by canals, and made reliable enough for a civilization to grow in some of the driest country in North America. It said storage could smooth out the extremes. It said engineering could turn a seasonal river into a permanent promise. It said that if the basin went dry, patience would carry the system to the next wet period. That story built cities. It grew food. It generated power. It created wealth. It also created dependence. Now the river is forcing a different question. Not whether the West can survive one bad year. It has survived bad years before. Not whether one reservoir can recover for a season. Reservoirs can recover. Not whether drought has ever happened before. Drought has always been part of the region. The deeper question is whether the whole system can change fast enough when the baseline itself has shifted. That is the message written into the falling lakes. The Colorado River crisis is not simply an environmental story. It is a story about infrastructure meeting a climate it was not fully designed for. It is a story about legal promises meeting physical limits. It is a story about cities whose pipes reach hundreds of miles away, farms whose planting windows depend on snow in distant mountains, power plants whose turbines depend on lake elevation, and communities whose water rights may exist on paper before they exist in a home. The reservoirs are not only water storage. They are a public X-ray of the entire system. They show the bones. They show that a river can still flow while becoming less dependable. They show that a city can still have water while becoming more exposed. They show that a dam can still stand while its operating range narrows. They show that a farm can still produce while its next season becomes harder to plan. They show that a legal agreement can still exist while the river beneath it changes. This is why the crisis feels so unsettling. It does not fit the shape of a single disaster. There is no one moment when everything turns from safe to unsafe. Instead, the margin shrinks. A reservoir falls closer to a power threshold. A shortage tier becomes more likely. A canal receives less certainty. A negotiation becomes more urgent. A farmer waits longer before planting. A city spends more money to use less water. A tribal nation demands that promises become infrastructure. A federal agency tries to protect two reservoirs at once. The system continues, and that is precisely why the warning is easy to miss. Many modern risks do not arrive as collapse. They arrive as normal life becoming more expensive to maintain. They arrive as temporary measures becoming permanent. They arrive as emergency plans turning into annual routines. They arrive as infrastructure quietly chasing the climate downward. Deeper intakes, harder pumping, narrower reservoirs, stricter rules, more complex trades, more careful forecasts, more pressure on people least able to absorb it. That is what Lake Mead and Lake Powell are showing. They are showing a future in which adaptation is not optional, but also not simple. Saving water in one place can hurt income in another. Protecting hydropower can affect downstream storage. Preserving city supplies can increase pressure on agriculture. Cutting agriculture without protection can damage workers and rural communities. Delaying tribal water infrastructure can preserve old injustice under the language of scarcity. Pumping groundwater can hide a shortage while creating another one underground. Every solution has a shadow. That does not mean no solution is possible. It means the river can no longer be managed through denial, delay, or slogans. The basin has entered an era where precision matters. Acre-feet matter. Elevation matters. Timing matters. Legal priority matters. Soil moisture matters. Snowpack efficiency matters. Human vulnerability matters. The truth has to be counted carefully because the consequences are already unequal. The central lesson is not that the Colorado River is doomed. Doom is too simple. Doom removes responsibility. The more accurate lesson is harder to live with. The river is still alive, still useful, still powerful, but the system built around it must be redesigned around less certainty. That is a more demanding truth than catastrophe. Catastrophe asks for fear. Redesign asks for discipline. It asks cities to prove that growth can be separated from rising water demand. It asks farms to be part of conservation without being sacrificed as disposable landscapes. It asks states to negotiate around the river that exists, not the river their histories prefer. It asks federal agencies to stop treating emergency action as a bridge back to normal if normal has moved. It asks the public to understand that water security is not only what comes from a tap, it is what happens in mountains, soils, reservoirs, laws, power grids, fields, and homes before the tap ever opens. The Colorado River has become a messenger because it connects all of those things. Snow in the Rockies becomes an acre-foot in a reservoir. An acre-foot becomes a release order. A release order becomes hydropower. Hydropower becomes cooling during a heat wave. Water in a canal becomes a crop. A crop becomes wages. Wages become rent, food, medicine, and stability. A shortage does not stop at the riverbank. It enters the body of a society. That is why the sinking reservoirs matter to people who will never visit Hoover Dam or Glen Canyon Dam. They are not just Western landmarks. They are examples of a larger planetary problem. Systems built for the climate of the past are now being tested by the climate of the present. The test is not always loud. Sometimes it is a waterline falling foot by foot. Sometimes it is a reservoir projection in a government report. Sometimes it is a legal deadline. Sometimes it is a field left unplanted. Sometimes it is a household that still has water, but pays more for the invisible work required to keep it coming. The final image is not an empty river. It is a functioning system with the warning lights on. Water still moves. Power still flows. Crops still grow. Cities still stand. Engineers still operate the dams. Managers still write plans. Communities still adapt. That matters because hope without evidence is just comfort, but evidence of adaptation is real. Yet the warning lights are not decorative. They are telling the basin that the old margin has been spent too deeply. They are telling every state, every city, every irrigation district, every power customer, and every household that dependence on a river is also dependence on the climate that feeds it. They are telling the country that storage is not the same as security if the rules for refilling that storage are changing. So the story ends where it began, with two enormous reservoirs sinking inside a system that millions of people still rely on. The waterline may rise again. The crisis may ease for a season. A wet year may buy time. A conservation agreement may reduce pressure. A new operating plan may prevent the worst thresholds. None of that should be dismissed. But the thing these reservoirs have revealed will remain. They have revealed that the Colorado River is no longer just a river being used by the West. It is a measuring instrument for the West's assumptions. It measures how much heat has changed the basin. It measures how much demand has been built into law and concrete. It measures how slowly institutions move when the atmosphere moves faster. It measures how exposed people become when infrastructure, climate, and politics no longer line up. And the question it leaves behind is not whether the lakes can rise. The question is whether the system can learn before the next fall.